All right. Uh, part three of the zany debate. The debate. It's not zany. The zany professor likes the debate. The debate itself is not zany. Absolutely not. So Ehrman believes, I got to get on it here. So Ehrman believes the only way to know if the oral tradition has been corrupted is to compare the stories, right? Okay. So Ehrman's challenge. Ehrman speaks of studies showing flaws in oral tradition. What studies though? He doesn't say. He offers an author, that's appeal to authority. So do differences equate to totally flawed oral tradition? And what of the nature of language? In other words, just because there's differences, language is analogical, not univocal. So if language is analogical, differences don't mean anything. They mean next to nothing. You need substantive differences, which he admits. Okay, let's be fair to Bart Ehrman here. He does admit that. So I took up his challenge. I think I'm obligated to in this case. And he says, what Ehrman says is this. He goes, if you don't believe me, he goes, look, people that already agree with me are going to believe me. People that already agree with Peter Williams are already going to be, and he's probably right about that to agree. Although I don't know that he's giving full credit to his opponents, and I don't know that how much self-investigation he's done on this, because he should have changed his mind about the resurrection. Because Craig just destroyed him in this debate. But anyway, all right, whatever. I took him up on the challenge. He says, pick any two passages in the Gospels, and you'll see differences. I took him up on the challenge, except for one thing. I reject his presupposition that differences equate to the oral tradition being flawed. That's conflation. Differences don't mean that because of the nature of language, right? That's one reason why. The other reason why is, again, charity, right? We say, okay, So I chose two. So I started with Mark. So I started with Matthew and Mark, and I chose the what did I have it written here? Oh well, I can't find it here. Anyway, I chose the beginning of the crucifixion, which is the procession. That's the Catholic term for it, procession. So I chose the procession. That's where Simon is asked to carry the cross for Jesus. So I read Matthew's account, and when I started reading Mark's account, I was like, oh, am I still reading Matthew? And I'm like, oh, it's identical, right? So I went on ahead and I went to Luke. Man, I wish the zany professor was here because he has glasses. So I'm sorry. So I went to Luke's account. Now this is going to be a little bit of a reading, but it's important. All right, it says, and as they led him away, they seized one, Simon of Cyrene, maybe? Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? All right, and then you get into the two criminals. So he goes, now a criticism right here from the get-go might be, well, I mean, if he can't even carry his cross anymore, why is he making a speech? But remember, I haven't talked about this much, but you have to keep in mind that many cases in the Bible, there are things that are summaries. And because they're summaries, it's not as important that we don't want to be too strict about the accuracy because they're summarizing things. Not that that's necessarily the case there. Okay. So let's get to all right, this is John's account. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with two others. Okay, so that goes, so much shorter account. You don't even hear about Simon. right? Does that mean the oral traditions are flawed? Why would I jump to that? That's a hasty generalization. Bart Ehrman unknowingly has asked me to conduct a hasty generalization. Two passages that have differences doesn't mean a thing. This is a summary. That's all it is. It's just a summary. It wasn't the focus of this teacher. My personal explanation that I just gave you as an alternative to Bart Ehrman's doesn't have the assumption of a hasty generalization in it. Mine asks you to go to the text and actually read it, use hermeneutics, study it, and learn it. This is a summary of the events. For the purposes of this author, that particular event wasn't necessary to discuss. Now, the synoptics come from a shared tradition, apparently. John comes from a different one. And the purposes of these two authors are very different. So, and he did not say to rely completely on the synoptics. He said just read two gospel accounts. He thinks this shows that the oral tradition is flawed just because there's differences. I just don't think that's true. I don't think it's true at all. Again, he sees it as a phone game. Ehrman believes the only way to know if the oral tradition is corrupted is to compare the stories. To his credit, at least he offers that. So I did do the Ehrman challenge. And then he talked about the studies, the procession, and then you have the hanging of Judas. So he picks one particular thing as an example, okay, in the hanging of Judas. And he claims it can't be reconciled. But here's the thing. The hanging of Judas can be reconciled. And Ehrman brought up a really significant portion of the story, but I think he knows it can be reconciled, so he kind of swept it under the rug. He said he was hung in one account. In another account, he fell headlong and his insides burst open. And then he mentions both accounts say it was called the Field of Blood. Now, this is interesting, just as a side note. Yeah, I have to talk about this because I did some studies on it. I thought that part of it was harder to, was more difficult to deal with than the hanging portion of it. But it's very interesting. Did you know in the two different accounts, the Field of Blood has two different names? One account is the field that was bought by the Pharisees. I don't know if it was the Sanhedrin. It might have been the Sanhedrin. I think it said Pharisees, but that may mean the Sanhedrin, right? See how language is used? Anyway, and one field was bought by Judas himself. So the 30 pieces of silver is blood money that he gave back to the Pharisees. And they used that money for something they call the Field of Blood, which is a different word than what you see in Acts. In Acts, the money that was used was ill-gotten gains or something along those lines. That was money that was reported in the Gospels that he had been stealing. He was a thief, it said. And that must have been the money the money he was using. It's possible that was the case, and that's why that field's something different. It's really interesting. I don't know if that's true. I'm not sure. I just think that I found that in Google as I was looking it up, and I was like, that's an interesting take. I don't know if it's the case, but anyway, it's a highly plausible answer to that apparent conflict. In terms of the physical death of Judas, Bart Ehrman seems to make it sound like he's using this as a launching point. If you hang, you're going to hang from your neck, right? You're not going to fall headlong. You're going to fall footlong. And this is where Williams made it. Do you remember, I'll call her Madame Mao. She wiped her servers, the female presidential candidate wiped her servers, and they asked her, they said, did you wipe your servers? And she goes, oh, you mean like with a towel? So funny. These people, no sense of humor at all, man. Woof. Creepy. Anyway, Williams, Ehrman goes, so if you hang yourself and you fall, how do you fall? And Peter Williams goes, down. Down? Come on, answer him. He just didn't, and I understand, Ehrman was trying to corner him in, right? And he wouldn't let him do that. Good part on Williams' part. But I would have said, well, you're referring to Acts where it says that he falls headlong, which is different than just being hung. Now, it's really interesting because when you look at the summary of Jesus to carry his cross, it says he went out. That's it. When you look at what happened with Judas, it said he hung himself, but that's it. And Peter Williams did a good job. He said it's underdetermined. And he had to agree with that. But he says when you go to Bart Ehrman said when you go to justify it, the justification starts becoming, he goes, because he said, try to justify it. And he said, well, he said, when the rope got cut or whatever happened, his foot hit something, he fell headlong, and then his burst, he goes, I'm not I'm not in the medical field. He goes, okay. He goes, but you have that's a highly implausible scenario. And he says, when it comes to trying to justify all these things, we're offering these scenarios that didn't happen. Millard Erickson in my theology text agreed with Ehrman. He wasn't talking about this particular element. He was saying some of the justifications for the way Judas hung and died, he said, are very expedient. And I agree with Miller. That's not the word he used. He said fantastic or bordering fantastic or something like that. And I agree. I see that. Now, in my other book, though, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, the traditional, one of Josh McDowell's friends said, well, I think what happened is when the rope got cut, his body must have hit below the tree, but there was a valley below it, like a cliff, and he rolled over it and landed in the cliff. And they said at the traditional site where Judas hung himself, that's exactly what it is. Okay, whatever. Bart Ehrman's point's well taken here. That probably, we can't ever prove that's what happened. But here's where Ehrman's mistake is. He makes it sound like every discrepancy between two accounts is like that. No. I watched a debate with him and James White. The differences was James White calls the movable nu. If you take Greek, apparently, I don't remember the nu, but it's where it's placed is difficult to ascertain sometimes. And he said even for scribes. So the first year Greek student doesn't know, and apparently scribes don't know either. But he showed a chart, and these discrepancies are very slight, and they offer absolutely zero a detrimental change to Christian doctrine. That's not what happens in this debate. You think that every single conflict is like the Judas issue. They're not. They're just not. So, so there are more now, the way he put it in another debate, the way Bart Ehrman put it in another debate was there are more scribal errors than there are words in the New Testament. And that was his debate with James White, which he also Bart Ehrman did not do well in. But White also pointed out the tradition of variance shows no centralized editorial authority. Now, what do you mean by this? This is critically important. It's not even part of this debate, but I'm going to bring it up here because it's so valuable. Remember, I said it's not like a phone game, right? It's a vast network, it seems, of copies. And in fact, James White shows that there's almost a 200-year gap between two copies. And he says, in the later copy is an accurate copy of this one copy from 200 years before. It said, but there's also elements included from manuscripts from earlier to the source than the one it's copying primarily from, showing that not only was it accurate from one angle, but accurate from another angle, that the copies so don't just see it as one line, right? Okay. Of copies, copy. It's more like this, right? Copies, which probably reflects the oral tradition. And he's showing that he goes, it does two things. These variants do something very important. If it was like Islam, where there's only one Congo line like linear progression of copies, you can claim that was the work of a supernatural God, right? Supernatural act of God. But all the skeptic has to do is go, no, it's a centralized editorial process. But that's not the case in Christianity. In this case, we have multiple copies with variants. There's a community that can hold each other's copies accountable. This shows that what we have is likely what the oral tradition brought and probably accurate because it reflects what the oral tradition probably was. And so the nuances that would have been in the oral tradition, one would have been words, which are malleable for you to get a proper understanding. And two, there have been cross accountability. It's not linear. Look, Bart Ehrman may have an answer. I didn't hear him give an answer because the phone game has been brought up in both those debates and he didn't respond to that. Why? Because I don't think he thinks theology is that important. And I know that phone game issue is not a theological issue, but he just sort of says he just lost his faith because of these things. Okay. So a mere difference may only show a difference, not necessarily a total flaw of the oral tradition. Again, keep in mind the analogical nature of words. They're not as rigid and univocal as Ehrman seems to assume. It is important to Ehrman to point out that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus never verbally claims deity, but in John he does. He claims this shows an effort to insert these words into Jesus' mouth. Peter Williams responds that it is implied very clearly in the Synoptics and even embedded in Jesus' words, like after he comes into the boat after walking on water, right? So just because Jesus says it doesn't mean that that's not the case. Now, what Bart Ehrman does is he says, I am not denying that the author of the Synoptics, he says, I'm not denying that they saw the deity of Christ. He's saying they never said that Jesus said he was God. That's significant. That's a significant point he's trying to make, because what he's going to conclude is that's something that was foisted onto the person of Christ. It's not something that Jesus ever said about himself. Now, I would point out that is the common pattern of rabbinic teaching to offer riddles, right? Which I've talked about on this channel a lot. John expresses his purposes, which may be very different from the synoptics, and therefore elaborate, possibly included more. Now, when I say synoptics, remember, I'm talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That Mark is the primary source, possibly the Q document, as I mentioned earlier. I just want to make sure that's understood. Let me reread that. John expresses his purposes, which may be very different from the synoptics and therefore elaborated, possibly included more. That's a typo of some kind I have there. So John's purposes for his writing is clearly stated, and they're different than Mark's. So these statements of Jesus are not in conflict with the synoptics, so they hardly prove that they are inserted by the whims of the author, right? Here's why I say this. This is important. For the synoptic authors, they're teaching, especially Mark John. Mark's teaching is rabbinic in nature, which means he doesn't mind withholding information. He may not report what Jesus said. And this is Ehrman's big flaw, in my opinion. He says, I don't see how that's possible. He said he would have to. It's too big of a claim. As I said it earlier, there are big claims, Mark, that Ehrman makes himself that he doesn't offer substance for. Number one. Number two, it is the rabbinic pattern to insinuate things and create riddles to be deciphered. It is a godly pattern, a biblical pattern, and Jesus did it too. So when you get to John, this is fascinating. You get to John, and John exposes, right, the fullness of this. And he says, here's what Jesus said. These are his claims to divinity. And Bart Ehrman comes along and says, well, look, this clearly shows an evolution. Everyone agrees John is a later gospel to the synoptics. This is an evolutionary process. This is something, and that shows that it was inserted. Who wrote the book of Revelation? Now, I know there's debates over some of this. I'm not denying that. But John wrote the book of Revelation, as far as we know. And what does he say about changing words? He says that the angel told him that the punishments of the book of Revelation will be visited upon anyone who changes those words. That's John, the messenger, right? of the book of Revelation. So why would he change anything in the Gospel of John? I'm sorry, I messed up earlier. Did I not say Luke is not a synoptic? Sorry. Hope you got this far in the video. Cue that out. Anyway, a quick Google search will show how wrong I was about some of this. Oral tradition, man, messing it up. All right. But think about this. So John has demonstrated that he understands the value of being truthful. Now, I understand Barterman would say, yes, but that's the tradition John was handed. But as we've shown, John would have had access to the Synoptic Gospels, or at least oral tradition. All right, so that was Barterman's biggest blunder. Kids coming home from school, have a good one.